My name is Jesan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 7, with my guest today, Dorollo Nixon. Hello, Dorollo.
Hi, hey son, how are you?
Great. Calpurnia. Peace ho. Caesar speaks. Calpurnia, hear my lord. Stand you directly in Antonius's way, when he doth run his course, Antonius. Caesar, my lord, forget not your speed, Antonius, to touch Calpurnia, for our elders say the barren touched in this holy chase shake off their sterile curse. I shall remember. When Caesar says, do this, it is performed. Set on, and leave no ceremony out. Caesar! Ha! Who calls? Bid every noise be still, peace yet again. Who is it in the press that calls on me? I hear a tongue shriller than all the music cry, Caesar! Speak. Caesar is turned to hear. Beware the Ides of March. What man is that? A soothsayer bids you beware the Ides of March. Set him before me. Let me see his face. Fellow, come from the throng. Look upon Caesar. What sayest thou to me now? Speak once again. Beware the Ides of March. He is a dreamer. Let us leave him. Pass. Beware the Ides of March. The man in question had been blind from birth. Then one day, out of the clear blue sky, he was selected to see. His eyes were opened, and then that's when all the trouble began. He was asked to justify himself, justify his healing, justify the miraculous. His parents abandoned him, as often happens in cases like this, and the community rejected him. Wondering why, he questioned whether the community was ready to believe not in him or the miraculous restoration of sight, but instead believe in the person who sent him. They rejected him, of course, the community, his family, and then they even rejected the message of the one who restored his sight. Throughout history, willful, obstinate blindness has destroyed more leadership in the cradle and in the real than any other leadership dysfunction. If leaders are willfully blind, they are self-deceived. If leaders allow others to blind them, they are irresponsible. And if leaders follow along with the blindness of the crowd, well, then they're merely sophisticated followers. There are many obvious problems beyond the mere fallacious that we can list with being a blind leader, but the most consequential result of leadership blindness is the inability to recognize and hold back the forces of chaos. You know, those forces cemented into ritual, cemented into literature, from Brutus, who we're going to talk about today, to the carnival of hyenas following Scar around in The Lion King. You know, the ones that proclaimed, no king, tra-la-la-la-la. What is it the Scar said at the end of that? Oh yeah, that's right. Idiots, there will be a king. I will be king. Stick with me, and you'll never be hungry again. Such forces of chaos rely on blindness, weakness, apathy, and most of all, forgetfulness. Look, a leader's fundamental skill set is to avoid blindness. And this is a leadership podcast. And so we're going to talk about avoiding blindness today, but also to avoid the seduction to become blind at all costs. The leader who leads best leads with their eyes wide open. The leader who leads the most courageously is the one whose eyes are opened, even if they have been previously shut. For, much like the blind man, all they know for sure is that once upon a time they might have been blind, but now they see. And hopefully right on time. Our guest today, Dorollo Nixon, is not only a partner in our business, HSCT Publishing, the publishing company that's wrapped around this leadership consultancy that's then wrapped around this podcast, but also he's an avid reader, a politico, a debater, at least with me anyway, around leadership, development, business, entrepreneurship, life, culture, the vagaries of being black, being politically conservative in a world, and also being a Christian in a world where all of those things don't always line up very neatly.
Or at all.
Or at all sometimes, that's right. When leaders are legally blind, people like Dorollo help them see. But sometimes leaders walk into blindness with their eyes wide open, and they aren't even remotely aware, for all of their power and influence, what they should be actually seeing. Welcome to the podcast today, Dorollo.
Thank you for having me this morning, Jesan.
Would you like to add anything to that rousing open? We opened with Shakespeare and a few of my own thoughts, but would you like to add anything to that rousing open?
I would. Your astute comments beg the question, what blinds our leaders? I think you've hit the nail on the head that blindness, which of course is another way of saying lack of vision, is both the first and the most fundamental problem of leadership that has to be overcome. So what blinds our leaders? What should followers do once they realize that the driver is asleep at the wheel, as it were, and either the ship of state, the ship of family, the ship of an enterprise is going to go over a cliff unless something be done? And of course, these or similar thoughts to these perhaps could have gone through the head of Brutus, Marcus Brutus, as Shakespeare wrote him. Not the actual Roman, but the Roman on stage could have gone through his mind if he weren't blind himself. So yes, what is it that blinds our leaders? Is it one thing? Is it several things? Is it always a combination of certain things? Good question.
Excellent questions. And on this podcast, we do talk about the intersections of leadership, perhaps not as broadly, but I would say maybe not as broadly, perhaps not as organically in all of those areas as in state, family, and enterprise. But I like how you broke that down, because leadership does exist in all areas. And, we've talked about how in our episode on 100 Years of Solitude, which I'll reference again later on, we talked about how in Garcia Gabriel Marquez's great book, basically family is the ship of state in that book. In the Iliad, we talked about, Homer and Homer's perspective on the ship of state, with the ship of state being focused around honor. One thing I want to get off to a running start on right now is this idea of Shakespeare. So let's talk a little bit about Shakespeare, right? So I'm reading from today Julius Caesar, the Folger Library edition of Julius Caesar. You can go and pick that up anywhere. I won't have links in the chat because you can just go Google it. Shakespeare's hard. Shakespeare's hard to get through for people. Shakespeare's hard to make interesting. We're going to try to make it interesting on this podcast today. Talk to me a little bit, or let's talk a little bit. Let's start with that idea of Shakespeare, right? Because I'm going to revisit this idea again, but I'll punt it up early. Shakespeare was really good at taking dramatic historical events, and probably his pinnacle of this is Julius Caesar, but taking dramatic historical events out of history and putting them into myth. There's a lot of the lines that we have tattooed on the back of our shirts, tattooed on our bodies, that we say in our common parlance. For instance, beware the Ides of March, that come out of Caesar. And yet there are generations of high school students that hate Shakespeare, generations of college students that hate Shakespeare, and generations of adults that wouldn't go watch a Shakespeare movie if you paid them. So let's talk about Shakespeare for just a minute. We know that he was a real person, and not from the movie Shakespeare in Love. We know that he was a real person. You know, we know that he really existed. We know that he really wrote, and that he was collating a number of ideas together. What impact has Shakespeare had on your life and on your experience, as a barrister, as a lawyer, as a person who is not only seeking to make the world right through the law, but also has not only an understanding of the dramatic, but understanding of how all these things click together. Contextualize Shakespeare for us a little bit. Let's start off with that idea.
Yes, absolutely. So it's fascinating. The Bard of Avon, Stratford upon Avon, certainly existed. I think we should address that point immediately. There were several, contemporaries of Shakespeare who wrote about Shakespeare, not just their own works. For example, the poet Ben Jonson, Johnson with no H, and Ben, apparently not Benjamin, but the poet Ben Jonson, who did a very good job praising his contemporary and acknowledging the superiority of Shakespeare. At the same time, he could still rib him over certain points. And of course, Shakespeare would give back as good as he could. But, moving further in time until today, I don't think Shakespeare can be avoided, because not only did he have a permanent and a pervasive impact on the English language, arguably he had the most permanent and pervasive impact on the English language in the last 1,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
If someone were to rebut that and they were to say, well, let's take the King James Bible, did that have a greater impact? Yes. However, it and its language would not have existed the way they did without Shakespeare, I would argue. Just to give you a sampling, the following words exist in English because of Shakespeare, either creating them or using them in a way that henceforth they are now continually being used. Accommodation, assassination, dexterously, dislocate, indistinguishable, obscene. The next word hopefully is not fitting here, pedant, premeditated. It's December 9, 2021. If we back up a month ago, there was something going on, not just in the social media sphere, but in a courtroom in the Midwest of the United States of America. And perhaps the word premeditated was bandied about during those proceedings by lawyers other than me. Reliance, submerged. Shakespearean. The genius of Stratford upon Avon. And part of his genius, I remember from high school, it being, taught to me. But let me back up. So I went to a public high school and turned around and went to an Ivy League school. And I have a degree in English literature from Cornell University. I remember, thank you.
Yes, Cornell.
Yes.
Some of us have heard of Cornell University. Others of us worked down the street from Cornell University. I'll just leave that alone for just a minute.
I ran down the street once. In one of my Byronic moments, I ran from North Campus all the way to South Hill, and it was it was glorious and surprisingly easy. And I say that because there's no way I could do that now. Anyway,
right.
No, I could do that. But I remember being excited sophomore year, taking my first Shakespeare class. And yet, I think I still remember the lecturer's name. I know I still have at least one of the papers because I found it, within the last year. As you know, we moved across the country from sclerotic New York to sunny Arizona. So I found one of these papers. I can't tell you a single play we read during that class. I remember struggling with the writing. That's about it. Back up to high school, I think we read at least one play per year. And I remember one of them and the teacher who taught it. And I remember my friends, Jesan and Patrick. They basically would go about bandying these expressions from Shakespeare from that point basically to now. But anyway, I remember that, and Bill Polito taught us Hamlet. And it was very, very applicable in our lives. The late Bill Pulido, I believe. So yeah, Shakespeare had a profound impact on my life, on my friends' lives. But yes, it's definitely hard to grasp, I think, in the way the language was written. But here's what Bill Pulido said. He said, if Shakespeare were alive today, and of course he was saying this more than 25 years ago, but he said, if Shakespeare were alive today, he'd be writing for television. So let's contemporize it for this morning. If Shakespeare were alive today, he would be one of the star writers for Netflix or Amazon Prime or one of these 21st century iterations of a Hollywood studio, right?
Yeah.
And he would do a better job than Hallmark. That is for sure.
Now let's not let's not knock Hallmark or the Lifetime channel. I mean, they've got good Christmas movies.
No, Lifetime. But Lifetime is different.
Lifetime
and
is
I don't
different.
know if they've had, a change in corporate ownership, but I remember switching from Hallmark to Lifetime and seeing, oh, look, this is a plot that I can figure out in 10 minutes because I haven't been exposed to it ad nauseum, Now,
Well,
I think there's a brilliance to what they can do with that one plot. But of course, one plot is one dimensional.
right.
And so some of their best movies, which of course, being a married man, I'm going to end up watching this Christmas season, right? Over and over and over. Over and over and over. Some of the best ones, those monoplots allow the characterization to actually get fleshed out in a way where it gets your attention and you can get sucked in, even though you know exactly what's going to happen the whole time. It's interesting too, because here, and then I'll cede the microphone back
Oh,
to you.
okay.
But it's interesting that here, one of the challenges for me reading Julius Caesar this time, which I did in preparation for this podcast, is knowing the historical outcomes better now than I did when I read this in high school. It makes it harder to digest because you know what's going to happen. You know who is going to do what to whom. And so you can't really be sucked in by the drama. And yet, for Shakespeare's audience, they also would have known what was going to happen and who was going to do what to whom. So I guess that's part of the challenge for the playwright and the dramatist, taking, historical material and making it not just interesting, but relevant. And of course, as you found, relevant for leadership and for leaders.
So one of the things that we want to do on this podcast is we want to acknowledge the power of language, like Dorollo just said, right? And so language, speech, brings ideas into existence, and ideas, once they are brought into existence, bring movement into existence. They bring inventions into existence. Words matter, which is why free speech. We are free speech advocates on this podcast, even particularly for speech we do not like, because speech is important. Speech, language brings reality to the world. You talked about the words assassination and premeditation, both of which matter very much in Julius Caesar. But both of those words set up real problems for leaders, right? They set up real issues for leaders. These days, and we're going to talk a little about the socio-political stuff around Julius Caesar, because there's no way you can kind of avoid that. But these days, we talk a lot about canceling, or we talk about social assassination versus physical assassination, right? Not only assassination as a state tool or as a tool of social control, but assassination as a tool of revolution. Again, something that was talked about and visited in 100 Years of Solitude. And I would encourage you to go back and listen to our episode on the dark triad of leadership, Machiavellianism, corporate psychopathy, and narcissism, and how those all come together. And what you see in Shakespeare, what you see in the play, which we will again read directly from the play today. I'm going to read directly from the Old English. I'm going to read directly from the Folger Library edition. We're going to try to flow on Shakespeare a little bit. I'm going to try to get a rhythm going there as I read from the book. But what you see in the language is Shakespeare planting seeds for all of these things, as Dorollo just said, that will come after right? And setting up the culture. And that's genuine power. That's the power of good literature. That's the power of a playwright, to echo what Dorollo was saying. But it's also the power of vision. And so let's talk about that for just a moment. Back to Julius Caesar. So I'm going to frame this and contextualize this for people. So Cassius now is speaking to Brutus. And he's kind of, well, he's kind of salting the dog a little bit here. So let's start off with Cassius. Then Brutus, I have much mistook your passion, by means whereof this breast of mine hath buried thoughts of great value, worthy cogitations. Tell me, good Brutus, can you see your face? No, Cassius, for the eyes see not itself, but by reflection, by some other things. 'Tis just, and it is very much lamented, Brutus, that you have no such mirrors as will turn your hidden worthiness into your eye, that you might see your shadow, I have heard. Where many of the best respect in Rome, except immortal Caesar, speaking of Brutus, and groaning underneath this age's yoke, have wished that noble Brutus had his eyes. Into what dangers would you lead me, Cassius, that you would have me seek into myself for that which is not in me? So Cassius here and Brutus are kind of going back and forth after Caesar's been warned about the Ides of March, right? And if you're tracking, this is again from Act 1, Scene 2, right? And so if you're looking at this first act, right, these first initial scenes in Julius Caesar, Shakespeare is setting up the weight of language. He's setting up the idea that people are going to be driven, as Brutus claims, Cassius claims, as being driven by their passions, right? And Cassius here is starting to gild a lily. He's starting to work Brutus over a little bit. And this is the brilliance of Shakespeare, right? Now, this play has 5 acts. Cassius initially, and I'm going to say this later on, is not set up as being that much of an interesting dude. He doesn't really get to be too interesting until that 3rd act and everything that happens in the back end of the 2nd act and the beginning of the 3rd act. He doesn't really get to be an interesting character. He's just sort of this slithering, sliding conception, and we use this here on the podcast a lot. We talk about this. He's a snake in the garden, but he's a snake in Brutus's garden. And so the thing that we need to consider in this play written 500 years ago, almost now, is how many snakes does a leader want to have in the garden, even if the leader's not in a leadership position? Thoughts on this? Because this is something that comes up again and again in literature, this idea that a leader has to watch out for the snakes, and sometimes they're not obvious. Sometimes snakes come in the form of chaos, like the hyenas in The Lion King, but more often than not, they come in the way that Cassius is coming. Dorollo, how do leaders navigate that? How do they deal with that? How do you deal with a Cassius that's floating around in your organization?
Very good question. And so the first thing I think that is necessary, and it touches on one of the foundational points of this podcast, as you know, is that leaders must not be blind to the fact that there are going to be snakes in the garden. That's really a recognition of human nature. In any organization, there are going to be leaders, there are going to be followers, and then there are going to be people who are just standing around, and then there are going to be the schemers, the meddlers, the busybodies. They're always going to be there. And so one of the advantages of having one's eyes open to the truth, as we have, being evangelicals, is that we recognize that this is what human nature is.
Now, isn't that a tragic view of human nature? Because, look, it's 2021, soon to be 2022. Again, to contextualize this podcast, as you just did, we've had jury verdicts, we've had protests over the last couple of years, we've had COVID, but those are all just knock-on effects from the larger issue, which we take issue with on this podcast. We covered in Unbearable Lightness of Being, this idea of the acidity of moral weakness, where we have nihilism. We are on the back end of 150 years of nihilism, existentialism, Derridian deconstructionism, and postmodernism. We have wound up in a clearing at the end of the path that all of those ideas get to you because ideas matter.
Mm-hmm. And we're still here.
And we're still here. We're still here. But but how do leaders walk through all that? Because here's one of the interesting things that we've noted and that we see, right? Leadership very often is blind. This is why we opened up with blindness. Very often is blind even to the impacts that those ideas, those snakes have had in its own garden long before they ascended to a position or a title. Mm-hmm. How do leaders self-examine that so they're not pulled in, like Brutus is getting pulled in right now by Cassius into a plot not of his own making, by the way, but he's getting pulled in. How do leaders walk through the last 150 years and not get pulled in by the meddlers and the busybodies?
Good question. I don't know. I don't know if it's possible for any leader not at some point or another to be taken in by the fumes that just happen to be in the air during his or her day. And there are certain things that help. I mean, the Bible helps. Looking backwards to a time where there were different ideas being bandied about, and then tracking what happened to those ideas can help. It's one of the strengths of the classics and of the canon based on the classics, is that there are certain fundamental truths that we in the West believe we have come across, and that these were preserved in literature, and thus literature is always going to be worth studying because it will always have a voice speaking to us about ourselves and about our events. And so, study has to be part of, how a leader fundamentally functions. It's got to be a daily task, a daily priority. And it here in this context, can help one see, okay, there's snakes in the garden. Okay, well, what types of snakes? Are they poisonous snakes or are they just slithering? Okay, because Cassius was not just slithering.
No, that old boy was all up in there. So I have one of the taglines on this, or the tagline for this podcast is, because reading and understanding literature is better than trying to read and understand yet another business book. Mm-hmm. That's the tagline for this podcast. And it really encapsulates this idea of us defaulting so much in business literature to philosophy or psychology, which is as a result of these Nietzschean / Freudian intersections, and even some Jungian intersections in there around consciousness and around, talk therapy and some other ideas. Okay. And I know I'm mixing a bunch of ideas together there. Folks, you can email me and tell me that I'm mixing a bunch of ideas together there. It's fine. The larger point is this. I worry that, and this is why we started this podcast, I worry that leaders aren't reading literature. Or if they are reading it, they're not applying the lessons because they're merely looking at it as entertainment. You mentioned Netflix, merely looking at it as another streaming show, right? Merchant of Venice starring Al Pacino. Hey, I'm going to go spend 2 hours looking at Merchant of Venice, and then I'm going to get out. It doesn't matter because I'm just going to go back to my real life. We kind of have this idea that psychology is somehow more solid than literature for a leader. And I don't find that to be the truth.
I think it's far less valuable than literature. It doesn't surprise me. It's because of its patent of science that, in my opinion, today it has the weight that it has. Even when it was first coming out, or at least Freudian psychology, when it was first coming out, about 80 years ago, I think I have a little bit more of an understanding of why it had some weight then. But post that to now, some of it is stayed, some of it actually functions and is helpful, but I think that they will keep running into the wall that was actually voiced by an actual Roman named Pontius Pilatus, right? Pontius Pilate.
What is truth? A truly great line, by the way, at the trial of Well, a trial of the man Jesus, right? What is truth? What does that mean? A truly excellent line, and something that not only have leaders struggled with throughout, well, all time, but really encapsulated in this idea that the West has struggled with, which is, again, a larger kind of macrocosm that this podcast sits in, which is about how do we, and this is why we started off with the book of Nehemiah, how do we go back to the core things? How do we go back to the old things so that we're not fooled by things that appear to be new wine in old wineskins? Once again, how do we not be fooled by the taste of that new wine? Because sometimes it's not new, sometimes that wine is poison.
Or the other way around. It's the same old wine that was kicked 20 years ago and is
Right.
more vinegary now. And if you put it in a new vessel, it's still vinegar.
Still vinegar. Back to the Shakespeare. So Cassius is still working Brutus over. So we start with Cassius. Again, Act 1, Scene 2. I know that virtue to be in you, Brutus, as well as I do know your outward favor. Well, honor is the subject of my story. I cannot tell what you and other men think of this life, but for my single self, I had as life not be as live to be in awe of such a thing as I myself. I was born free as Caesar, so were you. We have both fed as well, and we can both endure the winter's cold as well as he. For once upon a raw and gusty day, the troubled Tiber chafing with her shores, Caesar said to me, Dearest thou Cassius, now leap in with me into this angry flood and swim to yonder point. Upon the word, accounted as I was, I plunged in and bade him follow, so indeed he did. The torrent roared, and we did buffet it with lusty sinews, throwing it aside and stemming it with hearts of controversy. But ere we could arrive the point proposed, Caesar cried, Cassius, help me, or I sink. I, as Aeneas, our great ancestor, did from the flames of Troy upon his shoulder the old Achesis bear, so from the waves of Tiber did I the tired Caesar. And this man has now become a god? And Cassius is a wretched creature and must bend his body if Caesar carelessly but nod to him? He had fever when he was in Spain, and when the fit was on him, I did mark how he did shake. 'Tis true, this god did shake. His coward lips did from their color fly, and that same eye, whose bend doth all the world, did lose his luster. I did hear him groan. Ay, and that tongue of his that bade the Romans mark him and write his speeches in their books. Alas, it cried, give me some drink, Titinus, as a sick girl. You gods, it doth amaze me, a man of such a feeble temper should so get the start of the majestic world and bear the palm alone. Another general shout. I do believe that these applauses are for some new honors that are heaped upon Caesar. Why, man, he doth bestride the narrow world like a colossus, and we petty men walk under his huge legs and peep about to find ourselves dishonorable graves. Men sometimes are masters of their fates. The fault, dear Brutus, is not in the stars, but in ourselves, that we are underlings. There are pieces of this that are left off. I loved reading this. There are pieces of this that are left off. Cassius's entire speech, for me, is about the leadership issue of feet of clay. From politics, in a geopolitical context, let's put this in a geopolitical context. We now live in the backwash, to use this term, the backwaters, not of the Tiber, but of culture, even the cultural Tiber. We live in the backwaters of a cultural Tiber of 50 plus years of never trust anybody over 30. We fundamentally defy, dismiss, and in general ignore authority if we can get away with it, ignore authority as much as we possibly can. And this cultural erosion of a respect for authority was not nearly as present when Shakespeare was writing Julius Caesar. There, they had a different conception. They had the conception of the divine right of kings, right? They had the conception that there were certain men who were born to rule. Calpurnia is going to say this later on. There are certain men that were born to rule, and other people are just born to die. The Greeks sort of got this a little bit earlier, even than that. The strong do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. And we in the West have rejected all that, but we've taken the pendulum and we've swung it all the way to the other end, where we say no one has any authority, and every man for himself, and devil take the hindmost. Okay. In this section, Cassius is, and very cleverly Shakespeare does this, Cassius is showing how dangerous narcissism can be. But he doesn't have that word, because again, this is like 1,000 years before Freud. He doesn't have that word, right? He doesn't have the word narcissism, but he has an understanding of the psychology of the temperament of a gentleman who, A, does not want to bend his knee to authority, B, is highly narcissistic. I mean, we see this in the entire example of talking about Caesar and the Tiber, and then Caesar's epileptic fit, which we believe fundamentally now from historical evidence that Julius Caesar had some form of epilepsy, as did most of the folks in the Caesar Augustan genetic line that ruled Rome from the time of the death of Julius Caesar, almost all the way to the middle part of the empire, and then even in many cases was still influential to the fall of Rome, historically speaking. So we do believe that Caesar had some form of epilepsy. So Cassius is taking these physical things and he's saying Caesar is not a god. Caesar's got feet of clay. Caesar's just a dude, and how dare I have to bend the knee to his authority? How dare I have to trust him? Leaders are dealing with this now. What do you do when you're a small or medium-sized business owner, or you're a manager, and someone's like, screw you. I saw you last night getting drunk. Forget you. I'm not going to follow you. Or, like we're going through this moment right now in organizational culture called the Great Resignation. We have more people resigning from jobs than we do have people accepting them. Leaders forget figuring out how to lead a team. Leaders are trying to figure out how to even create one. Because now we've got Cassiuses everywhere, right? Everyone sees that everybody else has feet of clay, which means there's no forgiveness in the arena, which, by the way, I haven't talked about Christianity other than obliquely in terms of the Bible or Jesus. But Christianity also layered all that out because the tragic view of humanity says that if man is fallen, they need a savior in order to compensate for the feet of clay, because every man will disappoint. Okay. Let's not make this theological. Let's not make this biblical. Let's make this practical. What do leaders do? What do leaders take from Cassius's speech here about showing their feet of clay?
Well, you might wish to, but not to a Cassius. A Cassius, you would do better just chucking him off of a cliff. One of the issues, I don't really want to say I have, because it's from critics other than myself, but Cassius and some of the other characters in this play aren't actually characters, they're just types. So Cassius is a type who is reflexively self-oriented. You can frame anything Cassius says with the following words: not blank than I. Sorry, not more blank than I. Caesar is not more, whatever it is, than I. He is not more than I. Brutus, in contrast, there is no than I. In contrast with Brutus, the equation, as it were, for his whole personality is not more blank than I. It's just not Caesar, not more blank, period. That, and his political fault was that it was his personal honor. It was not, for example, the honor of Rome, really, because Rome wasn't offended. You look at the behavior of the mob. They weren't offended. They were they're obviously funny. But in the beginning,
yeah, the mob is great in like the
Right,
fourth
yeah.
act. They're fabulous. They're going back and forth. They're urging on one moment they're urging, hey, yeah, well, I don't want to give away the ending, but like it's an old book, so okay. Hey, yeah, we're in favor of this thing happening, and then they immediately move to the other side of, hey, is Mark Antony going to pay us, or not? Mark Antony going to pay us? I'm sorry. Is what did Caesar leave in his will? To what did Mark Antony? What's he going to pay us to be on his side? Like they're all over the place, which, by the way, is a commentary about democracy, a subtle dig at democracy and the idea of, which we'll talk about a little bit later on here as well. But this idea of the inflagration of mob rule, which again the ancients really believed, and it's interesting how we're kind of arcing back towards this idea at a geopolitical level, this idea that democracy, and we've been saying this for like 100 years now, we're a democracy, we're a democracy, we're a democracy, we're not a democracy, we're a republic, folks. America is a republic. Not a democracy for exactly the kinds of reasons you were just saying about the mob, or that I was just saying about the mob. But yes, the mob is fascinating and funny. They're hugely amusing.
And started off being in love with Caesar.
Right.
And so
they're all on board.
Right. And thus Brutus's offense, what offended him, big word nowadays, what offended him and not Rome. Rome meaning the mob in the street, as well as the Senate. They were on board with what was happening. And Brutus was not, but that was about Brutus, and of course, in my view, his essential blindness was that he couldn't see that this is not about either Rome's honor or Rome's good. It's about my honor. However, I lack the ambition to then take my honor, infuse it with what is for Rome's good. Because if he had, this play would have ended very different.
That idea of essential blindness, kind of flesh that out a little bit more for leaders. How do leaders avoid being essentially blind?
It's deep, right? But
that's what we do on this podcast. We get deep.
Indeed. And yet, one of the advantages for how truth is structured is that truth can be approached as a child would approach something. That's one of the fundamental ironies about truth. Kids will often get it better than adults will. And not just because they haven't been dressed up, they haven't been twisted up yet in a way with human nature that makes it harder for them to see certain truths. Obviously, there'll be truths over their head because they're not mature enough to handle them. But arguably, there are not very many. Or at least that's what this husband and father would say. But anyway, so first, the simple, direct question, okay, so why are you here? What are you trying to accomplish? So to the play, Brutus, what are you trying to accomplish? Oh, I'm removing the tyrant. Okay, who's going to take his place? What? We don't need someone to take his place. Okay, so who then will hold the reins of the state? That is one of the essential political questions that he failed to address. He failed to plan for because he failed to see it.
That's one of the things that we talk about in our consultancy with folks all of the time, particularly mid-level leaders. We had a question the other day from a client, and their query was this was the context of their query. They said, we've got supervisors who are basically terrible. They take all the credit. They give out all the blame. We don't really like them. Jesan, what do we do about this? And I said, well, you can stage a mutiny. You can stage an assassination. You can stage a professional assassination. But you better make sure you have all your ducks in a row. You better make sure that not only have you gotten the people on board, which that one seems obvious to most folks, get the people on board that are going to be on board with you, but then you better have a replacement idea, because when that person's supervisor who you're going to professionally assassinate, that person's boss comes to you and says, congratulations, there's a vacuum. Now you have to have a plan to fill that vacuum. And in the later part of the fourth act of Julius Caesar and the beginning of the fifth act, Brutus and Cassius kind of fall out. And we're not going to cover that today on the podcast. It's a great play. Go read it. Go get it. Go watch a film about it. Go listen to an audiobook production actually of it. Go listen to a full-throated British Shakespearean audiobook production. That's my pitch for that, because you're going to get all the flavor of Shakespeare there. But Cassius and Brutus are in this camp, and now this is where, again, Shakespeare's brilliance really comes in, because he's taking myth and now flipping it back into history and turning it back into, this is what historically happened at the end of Julius, at the end of Julius Caesar's assassination. But this is also what historically happens in general. You're talking about archetypes. In general, this is what happens when you assassinate the state leader. This is what happens when you engage in an organizational assassination. This is what happens when you remove the head of a household for whatever means. This is what happens. Nature abhors the vacuum. Einstein told us that. And so we told these folks, you have to have a plan to fill that vacuum. And much like Cassius and Brutus, when we mentioned that you might want to have an idea for how to fill that vacuum, all of a sudden the questions just stopped. Mm-hmm. Because everybody gets so excited fundamentally, and this is a fundamental, I think, of these kinds of ideas. Everybody gets so excited about the act of taking out the leader, the mutinous act, the assassination act. Everybody gets so excited about that. Mm-hmm. But they're not as excited about all of the structural things that have to happen afterward to support the organization, because it's not going anywhere. It's just going to be empty. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have the capacity to fill it, that makes you essentially blind.
It makes me think of, I'm certain, Machiavelli, but it also may be in Sun Tzu Ping Bao, right? The Art of War. Mm-hmm. The advantage of being able to take a state whole, mm-hmm. rather than to have to rebuild a state mm-hmm. that you have essentially destroyed, yep. or literally destroyed.
Yep. Machiavelli argues that in, I believe it's the middle part of the first book, or the middle part of the second book, when he's talking about statecraft. Again, we covered this on the podcast, episode number 4 or 5 with Erica Weed. Go back and listen to that. But we covered that, yeah. Like, when you take out that person, mm-hmm. nature abhors vacuum. So take the state whole. Take the team whole, take the organization whole. Oh, well, that's too big. I can't do that. I'm only a mid-level leader. Then you're not ready to engage in professional assassination. Mm-hmm. You're just not ready to engage in it.
Mm-hmm. And yet that person's problem will still remain.
Oh, and
here's this glory hound doing nothing.
Right,
so
exactly.
What am I going to do?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which is why we recommend that you use our products and services here at HSCT Publishing, like Leadership Toolbox, and reading our books, like the 12 Rules for Leaders, which is coming out in April, and of course taking advantage of our Leading Keys product, because these will help you stay on the path, so you don't have to destroy the entire organization. But if you're going to do it, we will give you the tools to be able to think about that critically. Back to the book, back to the play. So now Caesar, scene shifts. Caesar's walking, or it might be that he's riding. It's not very clear. But Caesar's moving. Caesar's on the move, right? Potentially going back to his house, his villa in Italy. Going to go lay down with Calpurnia, his wife. And he's talking a little bit to Anthony, and he makes an interesting observation here. Again, Act 1, Scene 2 of Julius Caesar. Let me, and this is Caesar begins, let me have men about me that are fat, sleek-headed men, and such as sleep o' nights. Yon Cassius has a lean and hungry look. He thinks too much. Such men are dangerous. Yep, by the way. Yep. Such men are dangerous, the ones who think too much. And by the way, I'm a guy who thinks too much. I'm accused of overthinking. I just started rolling in jiu-jitsu. And one of the big pieces of feedback that the instructor had for me is, you got to think less and do more. Like, yeah, shut up, go away. But he's not wrong. He's not incorrect, right? Think less, do more. Anthony says, fear him not, Caesar. He's not dangerous. He's a noble Roman and well given. Nope. Bad situational awareness there, Anthony. Mark Antony should have been smarter, which we'll get to this in just a second. Mark Antony should have been smarter as Caesar's number two. And actually, this is the time of the triumvirate to historically contextualize this. And so Mark Antony was always the weakest of the triumvirate. And Shakespeare shows this weakness. And it's not moral weakness that Antony has, it's ambition that Antony has, but he wants to hide his ambition. He wants to couch his ambition in glorious, honor-driven, virtue-driven terms. And of course, if he can ride on Caesar's coattails, he's going to hitch his star or hitch his horses to that rising star. Fear him not, Caesar. He's not dangerous. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about Cassius. Don't worry about that lean and hungry look. He's noble. That's a look of nobility. And he's well given. I love that term, well given. Caesar responds, would he were fatter. Now that's interesting in our day when we really value losing weight. would he were fatter, but I fear him not. And now Caesar goes to this core thing. I don't want to talk about fear here in just a minute, but I fear him not. Yet if my name were liable to fear, I do not know the man I should avoid so soon as that spare Cassius. He reads much, just like we do on this podcast. He is a great observer, just like we are on this podcast. And he looks quite through the deeds of men, just like we do on this podcast. He loves no plays, as thou dost, Antony. He hears no music. He's not falling for entertainment. That's what Caesar's saying here. Seldom he smiles, and smiles in such a sort as if he mocked himself and scorned his spirit that could be moved to smile at anything. Such men as he will never be at heart's ease, whiles they behold a greater than themselves, and therefore are they very dangerous. I rather tell thee what is to be feared than what I fear, for always I am Caesar. I love that last piece right there, for always I am Caesar. I'm obsessed with this idea. And I've been obsessed with this idea for a few years, but Julius Caesar really brought it to the fore, and thinking about Shakespeare really brought it to the fore for me. Throughout this play, Caesar never puts it down. He never puts down the palm. He never puts down the glory of Rome. He never puts down the glory of himself. Even when he's with his wife, he's still Caesar. Mm-hmm. Not only do we have the idea that leaders have feet of clay, and not only have we gone over in the opposite extreme of questioning every leader, but we have this other dynamic that's dark and underneath it, which is we want our leaders to always be virtuous and perfect. We saw this with, we saw this. He's a perfect example from my life. My mom, and Dorollo knows my mother. My mother said to me many, many years ago in the 90s, when I was kind of really excited about Michael Jordan, right? She said, America likes its heroes humble. And Michael Jordan, to tie this into him, said even Republicans buy sneakers. So he was never political during his career. Now, afterward, that's a different story. But during his basketball career, he never pontificated on politics as maybe a LeBron James, I'm looking at you, would do. But there's an argument to be made that our culture has shifted. And that there's also an argument to be made that with this idea of social media and the fact, not just the idea, the fact of social media platforms and the desire for authenticity, and I've heard this a couple of times over the last few months now, everybody's got to be authentic. Everybody's doing better when they're more authentic. Okay, but how much authenticity do you really want from me? No. You don't want authenticity from me. You want curated authenticity from me because Correct. As a leader, Absolutely. Right, as a leader, you want me to always be Caesar. You actually don't want me to be transparent. You really don't want that. Because if I get transparent, if I get really real here, I may say some things that you may not like. I may say some things that may have you cancel me or have you stop following me. I may say some things that may have me lose my job. Mm-hmm. How are leaders to balance these two tensions? Or is there or do you just live with the tension?
Hmm. Well, it's weird because one, it's a fundamental choice leaders have to make. Two, I'm wondering how much we struggle with the consequences of the choice rather than the choice. Because if you choose always to be Caesar, you're going to get stabbed in the back, even by your lover's son, because that's who Brutus was.
Mm-hmm.
Caesar's famous mistress, I believe it was Servilia or Servilia. She was Brutus's mom, so he knew Brutus, and knew Brutus in a way he didn't know the other assassins, and so that famous misquoted line, because Caesar was a very well-educated man and thus would have said it in Greek, which was the cultural language of the Roman elite, "Kai su teknon," and you, child, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if you make that choice to always be Caesar, you get stabbed in the back, even by your friends, let's say, son. Or you can equivocate, you can bend with the wind, even if you're trying to hoist a sail to carry the ship somewhere else, dash Marcus Antonius, dash, and where does he end up, right? You know,
He ends up in a camp fighting a war he didn't plan for.
right. But well, at least in this play,
or on the bed of Cleopatra, well, if you're Richard Burton.
In this play, he makes out pretty well. It's just
right.
In the subsequent play, perhaps, and certainly in history, we find out, he failed to take his measure, as you pointed out, of Cassius. That was not fatal. Fatal was failing to take his measure of Octavius. He would have been better served by having a maniacal passion that hated all Caesars, including the one who in this play he called Caesar after Julius's death, and just killed them all, than failing to take measure of the actual Augustus, right?
Mm-hmm.
The one who mastered the scene and fundamentally changed the nature of things, fundamentally took control of events and set in stage basically a chain of actions, a chain of behavior that lasted for centuries. So,
did Mark Antony have a failure in first principles, though? By failing to take appropriate measure of Cassius, he just repeated his failure with Octavius.
Right, but the consequences were so much greater.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. And so.
But I think you're correct. It's the same failure. It's his inability to size up a man.
Right. There you go.
And say this man is a threat. Stay away from him.
His inability to size up a man. And then you've got Caesar's hubris, which is in essence what you're really talking about not being able to put down being Caesar. So you've got hubris, you've got inability to take measure of a man. Then you've got Cassius's snake-like tendencies, and you've got Brutus's ability to be manipulated. No one here has virtue, and yet they are all speaking in virtuous language. Mm-hmm. And this is the dichotomy of leadership, as a famous book title goes. This is the dichotomy of leadership. This is the 2-in-1, right, of being a leader. You will have these weaknesses. You will have these blindnesses. You will sometimes not stay on the path. Mm-hmm. But the ones who succeed are going to be the leaders who succeed are going to be the ones who recognize it as quickly as possible and correct it and get back on the path. And Shakespeare shows fully, I believe what you just said, fully the consequences of that choice. And you talked about The Art of War, which is a book we will be covering in the podcast in some upcoming episodes, along with The Tao of Jeet Kune Do by Bruce Lee and Miyoto Musashi's The Book of Five Rings. We're going to do a whole thing on all of those, and we're going to talk about jiu-jitsu and the martial arts and martial thinking. Mm-hmm. These were martial cultures. So even though the Roman elite spoke in Greek, they were still martial people. They still believed in, at least at this point in time in Roman history, they still believed in the greatness of the Republic, the greatness of Rome.
Mhm.
They still had cultural confidence.
That's a really good expression.
Well, and a follow-up question to this is, one of the problems that I see in America, and I'm not the first person to note this, is that we seem to have a lack of cultural confidence. I believe that fundamentally that comes from leaders leading in small businesses because, as I say to clients, as we say to clients, and to contextualize it to Julius Caesar, you're going to the people who work with you are going to be more directly impacted by what you do than what the president of the United States does or Caesar.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You're their first point of leadership, not the president of the United States, not the local congressman, not even the mayor. You're the first point of leadership.
Mm-hmm.
How do leaders have cultural confidence? And I think small and medium-sized business leaders do, but how do you maintain it when it's becoming eroded all the way down to, I think, the core of America? And maybe I'm being, dramatic here to make a point. Maybe everything's fine where you are at, listener, but where I'm at, the window I'm looking out of, I'm seeing that erosion. How do leaders fight that on a day-to-day basis?
Actually have an answer. I'm slightly surprised, full disclosure, that I actually have an answer to that, not knowing it was coming. And
well, that's what we do on this podcast, folks. We set the guest up twist. And we see if they can punt.
Yeah. So I'm going to run with this one. I think it requires three things, and it's the last one that is the real rub, and that is counterintuitive. So these leaders have to know the culture. Okay. They have to love the culture. Here it comes. They have to change the culture. And so there are those who know it and love it and refuse to change it, and they're not leading anything. There are those who do not know it and claim they love it, but how can you love that which you do not know? Do you buy for your wife flowers she hates? Okay. Do you forget your children's birthdays? Okay. We don't believe you love them because you can't be bothered to know them. And so it's tricky. Also, knowing the culture and hating it and then wanting to change it. Okay, that kind of nihilism culturally is dangerous. And this day, we deal with a lot of that. This notion that, taking it back to the play, that there is no greatness in Rome, that Rome is the devil, and the sooner destroyed, the better. And those people don't see the barbarians at the gate, just waiting to get in and do whatever they wish. And so they make the worst sort of traitors. Brutus at least had an idea. He had an idea about something worthy. My fault with Brutus is failing to see the political consequences and to take measures so that once he got control of the state, he led the state in a better direction. That's something that I don't know if Cicero tried. I haven't researched it in preparation for this podcast, the Ciceronian angle. Of course, a far better lawyer than me, Cicero. Cicero, who became one of the triumvirs after Caesar's death, but Cicero, who ultimately was proscribed and killed.
Right.
And so perhaps he didn't take the right measures in terms of the changes that he didn't help initiate, but with his, amazing ability to seize what is there and then, go somewhere with it. It's just, perhaps he just failed to recognize how nasty Marcus Antonius might be willing to be, or perhaps not taking his measure of Caius Octavius, also known as Caesar, also known as Augustus. So I think it's those three things. You can know the culture, love the culture, and then you have to change the culture. And in so doing, I think you can, with a clear conscience, for those who care about conscience, and with integrity, for those who care about integrity, actually communicate what is good about our culture and then make, as it were, converts, you know?
That requires leaders to be evangelical about leadership. And it requires,
Right.
well, and not only leadership, but it requires leaders to be evangelical about the organizations in which they work. Because we're also a practical podcast here, right? And we've been talking very philosophically about literature here and contextualizing that into the philosophy of leadership. But everything that we have talked about today at a tactical level requires leaders to love the thing that they are in, to tell a love story. One of the things that we do with clients is we talk about in storytelling. We just did this with a client recently. We talk about what are the 5 stories that every leader hears in order to persuade other leaders. And so on this podcast, we are developing a quest story. This is a long form podcast, hour and a half, 2 hour plus long conversations about literature where you're not going to get everything in the first 5 minutes. You're not going to get everything in the last 5 minutes. You're going to have to commit to the structure. And that's because we wanted to do something where people committed. And some people will commit, some people will not. That's okay. Okay. But such a commitment requires you understanding that the story that we are telling is both a quest story, which I already mentioned, and a love story. We're in love with literature, and leaders have to hear these 5 stories. And by the way, all 5 stories are the ones that Shakespeare wrote about. So we have a love story, we have a quest story, we have a stranger in a strange land story, we have a rags to riches story or a riches to rags story. And then, of course, my personal favorite, a revenge story. Now, sometimes those stories are all mixed together, and sometimes they're teased apart. But in organizations, leaders have to tell a love story and a quest story together in order to change the culture. In order to do those 3 things that Dorollo was just talking about, leaders have to tell a quest story and a love story, not only to their followers, but also to themselves in order to become evangelical about changing the culture. Speaking of Brutus, back to the play, Act 2, Scene 1. We're going to kind of skip forward a little bit, go to Act 2, Scene 1. Brutus begins. He's sitting in his office, such as it were. And the way I conceptualize this in my head, the way I contextualize this in my head, and maybe this will help all of you who are listening, he's a man sitting at a desk convincing himself that this is something he needs to do, a path that he needs to be on, the long, dark night of the soul, such as it were. Brutus speaks. It must be by his death. He's talking about Caesar here. And for my part, I know no personal cause to spurn at him, but for the general. Exactly what Dorollo was just saying. Nothing personal, just the general. He would be crowned. How that might change his nature, there's the question. How would power change Caesar's nature? It is the bright day that brings forth the adder, the snake, such as it were, and that craves wary walking. Crown him that, and then I grant we put a sting in him, that at his will he may do danger with. The abuse of greatness is when it disjoins remorse from power. That, by the way, pause. That, by the way, is a line that every leader should have tattooed on their heart or on a cool looking curly Q text plaque in their office. The abuse of greatness is when it disjoins remorse from power. And to speak truth of Caesar, I have not known when his affection swayed more than his reason. I don't know if this guy, I don't know. But it's a common proof that lowliness is young ambition's ladder, whereto the climber upward turns his face. But when once he attains the upmost round, he then unto the ladder turns his back. Basically what he's saying is people climb the ladder and then they pull it up. By the way, we see this in our culture everywhere. Looks in the clouds, scorning the base degrees by which he did ascend. He spits on the people behind him. So Caesar may. Then, lest he may prevent, and since the quarrel will bear no color for the thing he has fashioned it thus, that what he has augmented would run to these and these extremities, and therefore think him as a serpent's egg, which hatched would, as his kind grow mischievous, and kill him in the shell. Kill him in the shell.
Mm-hmm.
Brutus admits here he has no axe to grind. He says, I have no axe to grind here. I am doing what I am doing for the state. I'm doing it for other people, and even more so, even at a deeper level, I'm doing it because in general, when men climb the ladder, they get to be ambitious, and then they destroy everything. So I'm doing everybody a favor here. I am doing what none of you are strong enough to do. I'm making the decision. By the way, pushed into it by Cassius, but let's leave that aside for just a minute. I don't. By the way, I can't acknowledge the sting that has been put in me. So okay, I am doing what none of you have the will to do. Saw this in a movie once. And somebody went, oh, it was Fight Club. That's what it was. Yeah. When Brad Pitt, great movie, by the way, from 1999. And most guys my age know that movie because that was one of the seminal films that we watched in our era, along with The Matrix and Office Space. That's the triumvirate. It's a weird triumvirate, but that's the triumvirate, right?
Uh-huh.
And Brad Pitt, when he shows up in the middle of the third act after the reveal that he really is the other actor, I can't remember the actor's name right now, but that he really is that other guy. And he says,
is it Ed Norton?
Ed Norton. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Brilliant actor. That's
Brilliant
why I
actor.
didn't want to let it go. I didn't want his names not to go mentioned. So Ed Norton.
So Ed Norton's there, and Ed Norton is totally blown away that Brad Pitt was living inside of him, and now he can see the thing. He can see his passions, and his passions are, of course, tattooed with a shaved head and a big old fur coat. This is a shout out to Colby Sutter, previous Book of Nehemiah podcast co-host there. But big old fur coat, right? And he says to the Brad Pitt character, basically says to Ed Norton, and it's the same character. He says, once again, and I'm going to paraphrase this here because I don't remember the exact line, but it reminds me of what Brutus says, or it surmises what Brutus is saying here. Once again, I am going to help you out, and I will lead you kicking and screaming into what you really want to do, and at the end of it all, you will thank me. Or, as Jack Nicholson says in A Few Good Men at the end of his brilliant Man on Walls speech to Tom Cruise, who's going to protect this world? You, Lieutenant Caffey? You know, you look at me and you spit on the name of the Marines. Instead, I would rather, if you're not going to stand a post or hold a gun, I would rather you just thank me and be on your way.
Mm-hmm.
This is an unexplored idea. This idea that there are put upon leaders in the world who are doing hard things with no thank yous, or who are about to take on a hard task without a thank you. And the thing they really want is acknowledgement, which is, by the way, another form of just rubbing their hubris like Caesar's. And because they don't get that, they have resentment. So the question I have, I guess, why was Brutus so resentful? What need did he have to be resentful? He could have just floated along. He could have hung out. Yeah, Cassius was talking to him, but he didn't have to descend into criminality and making moral and ethical choices that didn't represent his highest ideals. You know, and by the way, he could have voted Caesar out. It was still a republic. Now, there was a danger that Caesar would go on the other side. But these types of extreme responses put the body politic in danger, whether it's a small business, whether it's a medium-sized business, or whether it's a geopolitical entity. Mm. Why was Brutus driven by resentment?
In the play, I think it's because, and it's what makes him tragic, right? And actually a character, but tragic. His tragic flaw is his own notion of his own honor. And as a noble Roman, there cannot be a king. His own ancestor was involved in ensuring that. His own ancestor with, I believe, the same names, was involved in assuring that there would be henceforth no kings in Rome. And so here is one, and I believe the history was actually a little bit past that. I don't think they could have voted him out. I think the Senate actually voted him dictator for life.
They did, but that was it. So the way the play's set up, it's before they vote him dictator for life.
Okay.
So the the preemptory event. I can't think, that's not the right term, but the event that occurs that leads into the actual knife in Caesar is this fellow Cimber coming and, basically asking, hey, can I get a little consideration here? And Caesar's now distracted having this conversation, and they kind of jump on him. So Shakespeare kind of skips over that part a little bit, or doesn't include it. And I don't know if they didn't have any historical context for that we got later on in subsequent years.
Or it was just his work as a dramatist.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Giving people more of a choice rather than here's the fait accompli, Caesar's there. And now we're all stuck with him. He is the first man in Rome, something that I believe he himself said was all that he wanted, and he would rather be top dog in a mud puddle than second swimmer in the sea, as it were, the Tiber, the Tiberian Sea, right? But anyway, so as tragedy, Brutus's flaw is he cannot get over his own sense of honor. As a noble Roman, we do not have a king. Here's this man. What? They tried to make him king? What? He refused the crown? And then, of course, what he attributes to Caesar, and I apologize, I can't quote the text, but what he attributes to Caesar, of course, is not apparently what Caesar's motives actually were.
Right.
Nor does he look at who was handing him the crown, namely Marcus Antonius, thrice. And so,
right. That's in the very first act when the people, basically Cassius comes by, or not Cassius, Casca comes by, and then Casca's a great character, by the way. We have not talked about Casca at all, but Casca, who eventually wound up being one of the conspirators in the very first act, comes by and tells Cassius and Brutus exactly what the number of times were that Caesar refused the crown, and Casca's kind of cynical.
Retweeting. He's retweeting
the whole thing.
Retweeting the whole thing.
Retweeting the whole thing.
Guy.
Right. And later on, he shows up when the conspirators are going on, and then he shows up another time. I believe it's in Act 4, but he shows up another time. And in essence, he's retweeting again. Casca is literally the Jack Dorsey of Julius Caesar. And just like a retweeter, or just like a tweeter, he's annoying. Like, he's ridiculous. But he also wants to go along with the crowd, and he wants to be on the side of, and this is a popular term these days, he wants to be on the quote-unquote right side of history, whatever the hell that means. And so,
ask Fukuyama.
There you go.
Right,
go ask him. Or Samuel Huntington, although Huntington was a little bit closer on this than Fukuyama. But anyway, and so you've got these characters who their motives are cloudy. And I want to go back to this idea of being a top dog in a mud puddle. But you've got these leaders, not leaders, these characters, these men, such as it were. And by the way, all you women who are listening to the podcast, there are females in this play. But they are second fiddle, right? They are not the primary drivers. You've got Portia, who is Brutus's wife. And you've got Calpurnia, who basically warns Caesar not to go to the Senate, and he does anyway, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute, because the augurs and the soothsayers basically, he says the gods can't make up their minds, so I'm going to act, which again is another form of hubris.
That's a really bad form of hubris.
Really
Always
bad.
being Caesar pales in comparison to, heavenly beings said this. I know what I'm doing. Right. That's a very humanist flaw right there.
It is. And it just shows that these concepts are not new. Humanity has been struggling with these things for years, and literature brings us a way to talk about them and think about them. Mm-hmm. By the way, this idea of being a top dog in a mud puddle, wrote this down. It's probably going to show up in a Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast shorts. By the way, if you're not listening to shorts, you should be. They are 2 to 4 minute rants, raves, ideas, thoughts, stories that I have about leadership. And there's no co-host on shorts. It's just me talking for 2 to 4 minutes. You may want to check those out. We've got like 7 of them out right now, soon to be 10. Anyway, dropped on alternate weeks from this main podcast. Anyway, so there's this idea, and I'm going to explore it a little bit, like I said, in the shorts, but there's this idea that, and we take it from Milton much later, Well, about 200 years later than Shakespeare, roughly 300 years later, 2 to 250. That's closer to it. 2 to 50 later than Shakespeare, I think. And Dorollo will correct me in just a second here. But anyway, we take this idea from Milton, and Milton puts these words in the devil's mouth or in Lucifer's mouth, right?
Literally.
Better to, reign in hell than serve in heaven. Okay. But here's the thing. If you're a person of moral weakness, what you are doing fundamentally, and we see this happening everywhere, is you are creating a hell on earth, calling it heaven, and then claiming that you are God. Brutus, Cassius, Mark Antony, Casca, all these people we've been talking about today, even the women, Calpurnia and Portia, they thought they were creating a heaven on earth by removing this man, Caesar, even Caesar, but thought they were creating a heaven on earth by removing this man, Caesar, and instead they created their own hell. There's an idea, a deep idea in theology and philosophy that hell is not only the absence of God, but that hell is also what we create ourselves through our own hubris, through our own through our own overweening ambition, and of course all the other sins. By the way, sin means miss the mark. All the other ways we miss the mark in connecting with God, connecting with a higher power, connecting with being. If you're Caesar, being top dog in a mud puddle that you created, it's not really a good deal. You don't want to be top dog in a mud puddle. You also probably don't want to be top dog at the head of the ship of state. You want to be placed with... He did, right. You probably want to be placed where the gods seek to place you. Or God seeks to place you. And then maybe... because we're going to go ahead a little bit, we're going to move ahead here a little bit. Maybe it might be a good idea to listen to your wife.
Yes.
Back to the book. Back to Julius Caesar. Act 2, Scene 2. Caesar speaks. It's Caesar and Calpurnia going back and forth. Caesar speaks. What can be avoided whose end is purposed by the mighty gods? Well, maybe if you paid attention to them. Yet Caesar shall go forth. For these predictions are to the world in general as to Caesar. Now he's arguing with his wife here, or he's asserting, not arguing, he's asserting to his wife that the dream that she had basically means nothing, right? The dream of his death, the premonition of his death meant nothing. And then Calpurnia responds, she says, when beggars die, there are no comets seen. I love this line. The heavens themselves blaze forth the death of princes. The mob means nothing. Their deaths are meaningless, but your death will have meaning.
Celestial meaning. Meaning communicated by the stars.
Caesar
they responds, will, as it were, see your star in the east.
Caesar responds, cowards die many times before their deaths. The valiant never taste of death but once. By the way, this is on a lot of frickin' things. This is on swords. This is on holsters. This is printed on shirts. People don't know what they're printing on shirts. Be careful. Of all the wonders that I yet have heard, it seems to me most strange that men should fear, seeing that death, a necessary end, will come when it will come. Leaders don't have the luxury of facilitating pride and arrogance that Caesar is demonstrating here. They don't have that luxury. Showing that pride and showing that arrogance is a luxury. It's not a right. It's not a virtue. Plus, leaders should probably leaders should listen to their wives. And by the way, I'm looking at you, Jeff, and I'm looking at you, Bill. Looking at both of you. You both would have done better if you listened to your wives. Then Caesar says, what say the augurs? So they're bringing in augurs. Now, for those of you who don't know, augurs were basically entrail readers, because there was a belief in the ancient world that came out of paganistic practices that you could determine the future. In essence, you could augur the future, you could predict the future by looking at the inside of a dead animal, or in some cases, the entrails of a dead animal that had been pulled out and arranged in a certain way. And by the way, this was in all cultures. This wasn't just in Roman culture. They did this in African cultures. They did augury in Native American cultures, and they did augury in East Asian cultures. So Caesar says, "What say the augurers?" The servant who's bringing in the information says, "They would not have you stir forth today. Plucking the entrails of an offering forth, they could not find a heart within the beast." Caesar responds, "The gods do this in shame of cowardice. Caesar should be a beast without a heart if he should stay at home today for fear. No, Caesar shall not. Danger knows full well that Caesar is more dangerous than he. We are two lions littered in one day, and I, the elder and more terrible. And Caesar shall go forth." And then Calpurnia has the ironic response here. "Alas, my lord, your wisdom is consumed in confidence."
And might he have said, because it's in this play, "I am constant as the northern star." And fittingly in several senses, he then goes to his death. And so he got what he wanted.
He got what he wanted.
Caesar till the end. Yep, he was Caesar till the end.
One of the there's a lot of going back and forth about income inequality in our culture today.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of going back and forth about the nature of what is wealth and who has wealth and who has riches and what's a fair and equitable distribution of that wealth and of those riches to primarily Caesar. Let's be real here. Not to you and I, but to Caesar. And I pretty much on this one hold to what Jesus said when presented with a coin, where he then asked, "Whose face is on this?" And the crowd said, "Why, it is Caesar's." And then Jesus responds with, "Well, then render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and render unto God the things that are God's." And then again, in my head, I imagine him flipping the coin to the Pharisees and dropping the mic and walking off. Because that's a drop the mic kind of line. We have a lot of going back and forth about all of that. What is Caesar? Who is Caesar? Caesar is the government. Caesar is the power of government backed up by force. The ability to send the military or the police to your house and make you submit. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
If we have people, according to last count, 2,257 billionaires made more money than everybody else in the world in the last year because of COVID-19.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. That leads to arrogance. Forget the number, forget the income inequality, forget all that. I think the bigger issue is not the material wealth. I think the bigger issue is the arrogance that people sense underneath that sense of being able to be their own Caesars. Be my own Caesar at Amazon, be my own Caesar at Google, be my own Caesar at Facebook, be my own Caesar at Toyota, be my own Caesar at John Deere, be my own Caesar at JP Morgan, be my own Caesar at Bank of America. I don't have to listen to the little people, quote unquote. I just get to do what I want to do. And by the way, I get to negotiate with all these other Caesars and then go negotiate with the big Caesar. And none of you little people get to be invited into the room. Okay. There's a fundamental tension there that people don't like. Mm-hmm. And people have never liked it. If I run a business, though, and I'm not Amazon, I'm a small business owner, the fact of the matter is this idea of not liking it, of income inequality, of there being something unfair, has now filtered into the middle and small businesses. We're seeing this right now in restaurants where people are rejecting jobs at $15 an hour because they are saying, well, that owner's rich and making all that money. He's not Jeff Bezos. And as John McWhorter, the great linguist and now New York Times author, would say, We have to live in the present. We can't live in the past because no one cares about the past. He also says that richness or wealth is relative to where you are standing. So if I'm making $15 an hour, rich looks like a guy who owns 5 Dunkin' Donuts franchises. But what the $15 an hour person doesn't understand is the person who owns those 5 Dunkin' Donuts franchises might be only making $150,000 a year. And half of that's going to Caesar.
And he works a lot harder than you do.
but there's this conception from the $15 an hour person that that person is not working harder. There's the conception that somehow they are sitting on a pile of gold like Scrooge McDuck.
Right.
How do we resolve this tension in our republic? Because this, again, is that acid that's seeping down, I think, into small and medium-sized business leaders. I think you're going to have a revolt among those folks over the next few years because they're tired of getting lumped in. Mm-hmm. They've just about had enough. And these people tend to be, and I'm not putting this in a political context, those people tend to be apolitical. They tend to be very shrouded. They tend to just shut up and go do their work. I think that that tendency is about to end. How do leaders deal with this when Caesar's not only when Caesar's knocking at the door, but when that conception that you somehow have unearned wealth is being thrown at them, and they know the reality is not the case. How do leaders deal with that?
Well, the right kind of transparency, actually, ironically or not, was exemplified by the man who gave his name to this play, in that Caesar's road to greatness was twofold. One, it was being able to use Rome's political organs to advance his agenda. But also, it was being literally one of the best generals in history. And he didn't get to be a general because he was appointed that way, as much as he got to be one because he was a very good soldier. And of course, it helped that he was Gaius Julius Caesar, right? That he was one of the Julii, double I, that patrician family, even though they were broke and had been for, I think, a couple of centuries. But anyway, and they're also opportunistic. Hence, Marius, the plebeian, was part of the same family as Gaius Julius Caesar. Anyway, but Caesar exemplified the type of transparency as a leader, and that he was the general in the trenches. Okay. And as the eminent historian Paul Johnson wrote in his classic work, Heroes, Gaius Julius Caesar took exemplary care of his men. Okay. And here I literally mean men. And that is twofold. A bit of an aside. If you look at his behavior to women, forget it. Atrocious. Not trying to justify it. Back to how he treated men. Okay. These men, his legions, not Rome's legions, his legions. Okay. Yeah. He trained, he fed, he housed, he disciplined, he led them. Okay. He inspired them. He actually gave those little pep talks before battles where they might have been surrounded by Gauls or surrounded by whomever. Okay. Always coming out victorious, period, without exception, period. Okay. But it didn't end there. He then retired his legions and he helped them found cities where they could then have noble retirement. Okay. This Caesar was loved. He was loved by his men. They were loyal to him. When he crossed that river in northern Italy called the Rubicon, they willingly followed him. He led, they followed. And so to the question at hand, one of the follow-up questions it begs is, okay, well, can they see that leader? What is the leader actually doing? Maybe you just need to take a day shadowing your CEO and see how little time he has to do anything or she has to do anything other than leading the enterprise, and then say, oh, okay, do you want that? Do you want that? The phone is going off at 3 a.m. Do you want that? Do you want that responsibility, or do you just want to sleep? Do you want to be, how did he call them? Hold on, I will actually find it because it's in here. How did he call them? Don't worry, I'll find it. It's worth the wait, I promise. Do you want to be like that with the stress making you lose weight, or do you want to be sleek-headed? Is that what he called them? Yes,
Yes.
sleek-headed men such as sleep at nights. Do you want to sleep at night? Do you want to sleep? And now we'll go over to Jack Nicholson, right? Hold on. Yeah, to Jack Nicholson in in A Few Good Men, right?
Yep.
You want to sleep in your bed? Do you want to sleep comfortably and confidently in your bed with your wife, with your children around, everybody's safe? That's happening because I'm here doing what I'm doing.
Right. I'm doing the things in the dark that you won't do.
Right. There's not enough of that in the enterprise. Understanding, here are the things I do you don't want to do. And admittedly, there are leaders out there who aren't doing all those things, but their enterprises are going to crash and burn. You don't have to worry about them. The ones that can stay the course, those people are working 10 times harder than you. They're not getting paid, and you don't see it. You don't know it, because Hollywood is telling you something else, because that person on social media who seems to know, whom the source of whose knowledge you never question, who just seems to know, that oracle, that social media oracle, is telling you, oh, this is how this person is compensated. That's absurd. And so that type of transparency, Caesarean transparency, that I think would help. But that's not all. I think turning off the tap of free money would also help, because then you might understand why you need a job. You have the luxury of resigning when you don't have to worry where the money comes from to pay your mortgage, to pay your kids' school fees, to buy them Christmas presents. Yeah, you can resign when you're not worried about how you're going to do that. And when you are worried about how you're going to do that, you're going to make different choices. You're going to make different choices. Now, I don't only fault the employees, we're thankfully now more than a decade past where we were with Occupy Wall Street, which I saw in person because I lived and worked in New York at the time. Saw it in person, saw it within sight of Ground Zero, saw the protests, okay? There's a reason that free citizens of a constitutional republic are offended when a certain class of people can profit obscenely, Shakespearean word, okay, while everybody else seems to be going broke, okay? There's a reason for them to be offended, okay? Because the nature of that behavior is offensive, okay? It might be legal. That doesn't mean that it's moral or virtuous thereby, okay? We have a system where we only legislate certain things, and that allows the maximum latitude for people to use what they are made and what they can come up with to do great things, okay? Does it also necessarily allow for people to figure out how to skirt the rules? Yes, but people are always going to figure out how to skirt the rules, regardless of how many rules there are. That's part of human nature. It's also part of it's one of the problems of legislation. You can't legislate morality. So you can't come up with a set of rules that people aren't ever going to break, or that only, that the good people will always keep. No, it's absurd. It's never been the case. And, if you study the history of the Puritans in America, their experiment was a fascinating experiment in fleeing a tyranny to then set up another one, and in the name of not religious freedom. And to their credit, they weren't talking about that. It was their right to do Christianity their way. That's why they left to do that. Okay, great. And that they offended certain people, and certain people like Roger Williams, basically were kicked out because they didn't want to play by those rules. And to me, the fitting, not sentence, but the thing that vindicates a more moderate position is that as the country grew and as the populace grew, this is still pre-1776, you look at other regions whose populations then surpassed New England's. And it's like, oh, well, were these regions freer? In certain ways, yes. In other ways, absolutely not. Some were worse. But the fact that a more moderate way, and now we're talking the Middle Atlantic, a more moderate way led to greater growth. I think that that's actually beautiful. But anyway, I digress, as I am wont.
And with that, we're wrapping up. Closing. I want to thank Dorollo for coming on the podcast today. This was an excellent conversation that involved history and politics and economics and culture and, of course, leadership. Some thoughts that I have towards the end, and then we're going to discuss how to stay on the leadership path. Only an artist like Shakespeare, and by the way, we didn't get to the death of Caesar here today. That happens in the third act of Julius Caesar, right at the beginning. We didn't get there today. Only an artist like Shakespeare can kill the main character halfway through the play, and it still remains a compelling piece of leadership literature. That goes to Dorollo's point about being a narrative and being a dramatist, being a person who could write for Netflix or write for the stage. A true, genuine talent. The turning and transforming of the characters in this play from rogue revolutionaries to trapped and chased criminals occurs in the fourth act of this play. And what happens then, and this is again an amazing turn, is the obverse of what happened in 100 Years of Solitude with Macondo. And it begins to happen with Rome and these guys. Rome moves out of history and reality and into drama. And with that turn, the shades of myth and legend get drawn across the empire. And thus we get to talk about it today. Separated from almost half a millennium now, the play may seem anachronistic. The language, the breaks, the old English. Yet we still quote from Shakespeare. We still quote the words without knowing the provenance or understanding the lessons. Moral clarity, transparency, how to take the measure of a person, even the importance of having a plan. None of this is new stuff for leaders. This is all embedded in our time and almost taken for granted. The leaders who do best are the ones who pull out what is taken for granted and rebuild it, rethink about it, revisit it in a different kind of way. And they use this revisiting, they use this rebuilding to stay on the leadership path. They use this rebuilding to make sure they don't repeat the same mistakes of the past. And by the way, they use this rebuilding to open their eyes, to stop their own blindness, and to give their followers the ability to see. Well, that's it for me. Dorollo, do you have anything for our listeners today? Do you have anything you'd like to promote? Anything you'd like to talk about here at the end of our time?
Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I haven't come to bury Caesar, but to praise him, as we have been doing for the last hour and 20 minutes. So I'm a published author, as I believe Jesan indicated. I wrote a book called Disruptor in Chief, Why Donald Trump Won and Why He Will Win Again. And that came out a week before the election in 2020. And I'm currently working on a book that is about the life of liberty under lockdown. And because I am ambitious, though I'm not Caesar, I'm examining it from the perspective of multiple English-speaking nations. And the reason is we share a common set, not just a language, but a language that embodies a common set of presuppositions, of expectations about how freedom and liberty function and how they function under law. And I believe that those assumptions have largely been turned on their heads by multiple governments all over the world, but most important to my analysis, within the English-speaking national family. And so I think that we need to address that before it's too late, before We have more Antonys doing what they're doing. And one of the things that's manifest in Antony that Caesar talks about, that others talk about, was his internal moral corruption. And so he was the best at manipulating the mob. Caesar wouldn't deign to manipulate the mob, neither would Brutus. But Brutus lacked, again, that political vision to see where his honor would lead, not him, but the state. Okay. Anyway, I believe we need to begin to examine and address what has been happening before we have more Antonys foisted upon us. Because the lives that we lead, they depend on freedoms to do certain things. And I will not take those for granted. I won't take them for granted because literature and history tell me not to take them for granted because they can be taken away. Because they can be taken away under pretenses of actually caring for me. And as we know from this play and from other plays, the crowd can be swayed one way or another, depending on how the winds blow, depending on, is the sun shining or is it raining out? The entrails of an animal. That is sophisticated science compared to what direction is the wind blowing? Oh, it's going to and
so we will.
Yeah.
We will.
So that's what I'm working on. So hopefully y'all will lend me your ears when the time comes and buy my book.
We'll have Dorollo back on the podcast when the book comes out to talk about the book, talk about history, literature, politics in the context of the book. If you'd like to stay on the path with us, please visit hsctpublishing.com. I've written a couple of different books. Marketing for Peace Builders, How to Market Your Value to a World in Conflict, and My Boss Doesn't Care, 100 Essays on Disrupting Your Workplace by Disrupting Your Boss. You can get both of those on Amazon. And I've got the upcoming book in April of 2022, 12 Rules for Leaders, the Foundation for Intentional Leadership, coming out April 2022. Please join my pre-order list by sending me an email, ceo@hsconsultingandtraining.com, or just heading over to the HSCT Publishing website and fill out the contact form if you'd like to join our pre-order list and put in the subject line, pre-order. If you'd like to check out our Leading Keys solution for training your small and medium-sized business leaders in the tactical and practical rather than the philosophical, the theoretical, and the theological of leadership, go over to leadingkeys.com and check out that website. We're also launching a website, leadershiptoolbox.us, for our cohort-based remote leadership development product, Leadership Toolbox. That has 12 modules of content plus coaching and a certification for you and your team. It takes about 4 to 12 months to go through the process, and we build relationships with you to make your team better, make your managers and supervisors better, and ultimately make your organization and your culture better. Check out all of our podcasts, this one, of course. And coming in 2022, we'll have a new podcast, Leader Buzz, the most important leadership headlines of the week, inside of 10 minutes. It'll be streaming on YouTube and later on to be released as an audio version the same week. So we're launching Leader Buzz in 2022. We're also launching the My Boss Doesn't Care book podcast, a podcast for me talking about the essays in the book, My Boss Doesn't Care. And that will be a limited edition podcast. Only going to do 100 episodes of that one. So check it out at mybossdoesn'tcarepodcast.fm. Finally, social media. You can check us out on all of the socials. We are on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. We're putting out content in all of those spaces. I would encourage you to go and subscribe to the YouTube channel as soon as you finish watching this video. So hit the doodly doot, hit the like, subscribe, share it to your friends. Check out the HSCT Publishing channel on YouTube, as well as the Jesan Sorrells Experience channel on YouTube. And finally, if you'd like to book me directly, and go over to jesansorrells.com for booking information. If you'd like to get me to come into your organization to do a keynote or to sit down and have a conversation with folks about the intersections between literature, life and leadership, or just to be able to answer some questions for you about how you tactically and practically put all of this into play in the world right now. All right, that's it. I'm out.